Sir Peter Hendy is Chair of Network Rail, former Commissioner of Transport for London and Chair of the London Legacy Development Corporation. He also generously drives his own Routemaster on charity bus tours of development projects in London, which I jointly organise with him. So, Peter, there have been calls this week from office landlords for greater clarity about the use of public transport. Shobi Khan, Chief Executive of Canary Wharf Group, has said it's an oxymoron that people could fly to different countries but can't get into work. And the government's advice is for people to work from home if they can. But Sadiq Khan says the capital is open for business. So how do we get the balance right between health and economics at the moment?
When lockdown started, it was I think the public transport industry, the rail and bus and TfL did a great job, because we immediately altered the levels of service, and of course the messaging at that stage was stay at home and leave what was running in public transport for essential workers, NHS staff and others. And that was the right message. And certainly when social distancing was at 2 meters. And I think that what's happened is that the message that you shouldn't use public transport except if you're an essential worker has transformed into a worry about the safety of public transport, because people are saying, oh, well, don't use public transport. And the truth of it is that there still is a case to be wary about the capacity of public transport, because although since then the government have mandated face coverings, which is clearly the right thing to do, they protect other people from you. There's some debate about whether they protect you from other people or how much they do it, but it's clearly a sensible thing to do. And now the guidance is 1 meter or 1 meter plus, and be careful of crowded spaces. So there's a bit more capacity on public transport. I and my colleagues are working really hard with government to try to get a decent scientific or medical definition about how we can get the capacity up better, because it is clear that, for example, facing somebody in a seat, sitting opposite somebody for 2 or 3 hours clearly exposes you to more airborne virus risk than it would be if you sit airline style behind somebody, and especially with a high seat back and in either air conditioned or well ventilated circumstances. And on buses particularly, you might only have to do that for 10 or 15 minutes. And if we can get the capacity of public transport back up from the theoretical 15 to 20% at 2 meters, and maybe 25 or 30% at 1 meter, to something which recognises the circumstances in which you're sitting behind people, that you're not facing them directly, or if you pass them, you're only passing them for short periods, then I think the public transport capacity will be much improved. And we are actively talking with government about them changing the message at the stage at which we can say that public transport is safe to use at a much higher level of capacity than has been the case since the crisis started, because it is really important that the foundation of living in modern cities, and the reason why people want to live in modern cities, is that you are with and near other people. So it's counterintuitive to say, oh, well, it's okay to be at work, but public transport is somehow unsafe. And there's no evidence around the world. There are studies from continental Europe, from Japan, and from the US that suggest that actually public transport is not of itself a source of transmission of this virus. So we are really working as hard as we can. This morning I was on a call with the rail minister. I am expecting, just as I was called to look at the earlier work to come out of COVID and face coverings, I'm expecting to spend August making sure that we've got a good story and a good marketing effort and a welcome back to public transport, if not before, certainly for the start of September and the schools coming back.
NLA had an exhibition back in 2013 when you were at TfL, and it was called Planes, Drains and Trains. And I was reading it just the other day. It had a hugely optimistic view of the investment going into London's infrastructure, expecting Crossrail 2 to happen anytime, a possibility of even a whole new airport. But we're in a very different place now with government policies of rebalancing the national economy, Brexit, let alone the sort of impact of Crossrail 1 and COVID-19 on TfL's financing. So how do you think we should be keeping London moving in a very different climate than we had back then?
Well, it's a very good question. TfL is in a hard place financially because the lockdown and leaving the capacity of public transport that there has been to essential workers is essentially removed all the income from every sort of public transport in Britain. And on the railway, the government had to take direct control, which means the government is paying the whole cost of the railway. It's paid bus operators outside London considerable amounts of money for the same reason. And in TfL's case, of course, because it reports to the mayor, the mayor has had to ask the government, who have come forward, and Mike Brown, who's just stepped down as the commissioner who followed me, welcome that support. But there's more that needs to be done, and the government are probably not unreasonably, because they're putting so much money in, want to know that their money is well spent. I think that that's there's clearly political differences between the government and the mayor, but I think if you look a bit further than that very short term thing, there isn't any doubt that the economic success of our city is based on the ability of people to move around it seamlessly. And that's why people, that's the same answer as the previous question. It's why people live in cities, so you can be near people, both to create economic wealth and for social and educational and all sorts of other reasons. And I've no doubt that there'll be a way found to pay for public transport in London, just as I've no doubt that we will continue on the National Railway network to serve the population and freight movement. And in fact, actually, I think what many people are missing in these arguments is that actually government, without much difficulty really, has found itself willing to put in enormous sums of money to keep public transport and freight going, because they realise the economic benefit of connectivity. So I'm sure that TfL will continue. It's essential that the city has tubes and buses. There clearly will be some differences. You know yourself that this is an opportunity that's being taken to rebalance road space in favour of pedestrians and cyclists. Why not? Actually, with a city with the air quality problems of the size that London has, it's not a bad thing to do. As to new infrastructure, well, actually, we're still waiting for Crossrail 1, sadly. But when it comes, it will demonstrate the absolute utility of such a new railway. And I doubt, frankly, that everybody can speculate about the effect of COVID, but I think our city will recover well, because there's still more economic impact for a job in London than there is anywhere else. And I think Crossrail 1 will demonstrate the utility of such a large increase in transport capacity. The government are talking about more investment in projects, and I would certainly hope, in the National Railway network, we're looking at a whole range of schemes, obviously for Northern England and the Midlands, because they've got a commitment there. But nearly every scheme that you do on radial railway routes benefits London as well. If we electrify the Middle and Main Line to Derby, to Nottingham, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, and Sheffield, that will have a further beneficial effect on the connectivity of London. And I don't think if you ask the government, they'd see it either or. Nobody's said to me in the middle of this crisis somehow we should be building more roads, because I think it's a political impossibility to build serious road building in such a crowded country. So I think the investment will continue. I think we shouldn't resent investment in the rest of the country. I think London's turn will continue to come. I mean, the Piccadilly line trains, not commissioner anymore, but they were introduced in 1973 when I was still at university, and they're now, well, you don't have to be Einstein to work out they're nearly 50 years old, and they'll have to be replaced. So that investment really ought to continue to come. And actually, Peter, I'm I'm still not in. I'm sure there'll be more home working. I think one of the things that we in public transport have got to cope with is people no longer working 5 days a week in an office. That was already starting actually. If you even before this happened, Friday and Monday were days of lesser travel on the National Railway network into London. So that will continue. But I'm sceptical that you can work at home 5 days a week every week. I don't like it, and I don't suppose you like it either. I want to go out. I want to meet people. I want to talk to them. I want to have a cup of coffee with them. I want to be sociable. And that's what living in the city is all about.
How does all this impact on your plans for delivering the Olympic legacy, which of course was another real key part of the early part of your period at TfL?
We had to stop construction in the Olympic Park on two big projects. One is East Bank, which is the cultural and educational quarter, which is new campus for University College London, London College, new building for the London College of Fashion, the BBC, Sadler's Wells, and the V&A. We had to stop for a few weeks because of COVID. The building sites for some of the housing developments on the park certainly slowed down if they didn't completely stop. And those projects will take longer to deliver because although construction's restarted, we've still got to be rightly careful for the construction workers with social distancing. But I'm delighted that the commitment of the partners, for example, at East Bank, is now as strong as it's ever been. And if you think about, East London is still a relatively deprived community. It's culturally very diverse. It's got a lot of young people. The partners who want to come to East Bank are very keen to come, not only because there'll be new facilities for them, but because actually they'll have an impact, a cultural and educational impact on a part of London that really, really deserves it. So it's going to cost a bit more, East Bank, because construction's been stopped and is slower. I think it's going to make the cost of delivering future housing a bit more, but actually I see no diminution of the commitment of the Mayor, of the Development Corporation, nor of our individual partners for delivering it. And what I would say is, I used to say this before the pandemic, the present plans for the LLDC see the corporation abolished by 2024. And the reason for that is that the park won't have been completely built out, but all its plans will be underway. If you think about it, that will have been less than 20 years from the original win of the Olympics, which was 15 years ago this week. And I think by some measure, that's the most successful regeneration scheme attached to any Olympic Games ever. And it's probably the most successful large regeneration scheme in any world city, actually, ever. 20 years to redevelop a complete quarter of London from wasteland and appalling housing where it existed to a new quarter with tens of thousands of jobs, cultural and educational institutions, and a lot of good new housing, and really good new housing, good new mixed housing. Even if we're a year late, well, shrug your shoulders. That's a pretty good outcome. And we're not good in this country about saying what works. We're very critical of ourselves in things that don't work. And I think the concept of a mayoral development corporation, I think Ken's original vision of the Olympics, carried on by Boris, I think even now we can stand back and say, wasn't that a success? And if we can still finish it, even if it's a year or two late, because of COVID, I think that's something that as a nation and a city we ought to be really proud of.
Right. It's good to have something to celebrate. So also Network Rail has just launched a big international design competition to shape Britain's future railway stations. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I can. I'm delighted to talk to you about it. So when I went to Network Rail 5 years ago, I left an organisation, TfL, with a very long and a noble history of good design and contribution to living in London. If you write the Johnson typeface, if you write any word in it, it looks like London. Even if you write Tokyo in Johnson typeface, it intuitively tells you that it's something to do with London. And at TfL, though there were occasional aberrations, good design is built into the organisation. People felt ashamed if they produced something which wasn't in the great tradition of Pick and Ashfield and Johnson. The National Railway Network ought to be proud because we're the Andrew Haynes, who's the chief executive, who's an architectural nut, and I have in our portfolio some absolutely stunning buildings in London and across the country. You know, Paddington, St Pancras. You know, go where you want. We're the inheritors of the world's oldest railway and some of the most fabulous architecture and civil engineering. But in recent years, it's become a bit balkanized and a bit sort of slightly grubby and slightly incoherent. And there are some individual examples of good modern stations, but they've been done on a piecemeal basis. And certainly the history of the 60s and 70s we can't be proud of, because quite a lot of perfectly good buildings were demolished simply to save the cost of maintenance. So we've got a chap called Anthony Dewar, who's the head of professional head of buildings and architecture, who was on a bit of a limb before I turned up and Andrew turned up. But poor Anthony has now rushed off his feet because he's now got somebody who's dead keen on architecture as the chief executive and somebody who's pretty keen on transport history and design as the chairman. So Anthony has been enthusiastically upping the profile of design within Network Rail, which has seen itself sometimes as an engineering organisation. Good design, as you will know, starts with the concept of what you're trying to do, and you then design your building or project or structure from a good understanding about the functionality and purpose of it. So we've done a competition about footbridges, which produced some really exciting results, and we've now got a catalogue of footbridge designs to replace some of the rather ugly engineering-led solutions. And Anthony rightly has now upped his sights to stations with big RIBA competition titled Reimagining Railway Stations Connecting Communities, which recognises that the station isn't just a place that you travel from, it's actually part of the community. The best stations are ones where people come to meet their friends and family or depart from them. They should have a cafe or a restaurant because they should be nice places to be. And indeed, some of ours are now, actually. St Pancras and King's Cross are good places to eat. Waterloo, I'm happy to eat in Waterloo in normal times. It's where my office is. So Anthony has teed up the RIBA to help us run this competition. We're really excited. If we get ideas as good as the ones that we got for footbridges, we will be doing really well. We're also working to get young designers involved in all of this, which is fantastic too. And one more thing, which is an exclusive, Peter, when this goes out. So one of the things I was proudest of doing at TfL was that I got the Johnson alphabet just gently tidied up for its 100th anniversary. London Transport did one or two ghastly things to it in the 1980s. They put a serif on the one on a what's supposed to be a sans serif alphabet, So we tidied it up. John Hunter did it at TfL. We tidied it up. And it's called Johnson 100, and it's a very nice, modern version of Johnson with an ampersand for use in email addresses and so forth, and it's doing rather well. The rail industry, of course, had Margaret Calvert's rail alphabet, which British Rail used to modernise the old image of British Railways from the mid-60s. And we still got it, but it isn't much used now. Network Rail invented its own called Brunel. I think Brunel would have been pretty horrified by the typeface that we're using, and it's not well used. It's yellow letters on a blue background, which are virtually impossible if you're not well sighted. So here's a spoiler, which is that I got Anthony to ask Margaret to just cast their eye on the rail alphabet from the 1960s, so it's good for the 2020s. Just like the Johnson 100, it needs an ampersand, it needs to be translatable into modern computer graphics. And we're looking to have an exhibition in the Design Museum in October to publicise the new rail alphabet with Margaret, hopefully, who's still alive and going strong, who's done a lovely job on it. And so I'm really looking forward to that, because I think our national railway system deserves as good architecture and design and as good a alphabet and a way of presenting itself as London Transport. And if Andrew and I, as temporary custodians of a 190-year-old railway, can contribute our part to it, then we'll be pretty pleased with ourselves. And I hope that, you know, I hope that everybody in the architecture and art and design community will be pleased too, because railways and railway stations ought to be just another expression of design and engineering elegance, and you ought to feel welcomed in every railway station, and you ought to feel that you can find your way and see where you're going. Edward Johnson once told one of his classes that if that they could tell their relatives that before him nobody could ever tell where a bus was going, because you couldn't sort out the destination from the adverts. And I think Andrew and I at least would like to claim that we'd started the process of making railways and railway stations more accessible and more part of the economy and society in which we live. So we think that would be a pretty good epitaph.
This year we haven't managed to do any of our architecture and property tours because of the pandemic, but I saw on Twitter the other day that you had been able to get out for a drive with a very limited passenger load, but you seem to enjoy driving buses as much as you enjoyed running a bus company. So what's the fascination with Routemasters for you?
Well, I'm sort of that era, really. I think they are wonderful vehicles. When there was a lot of politics as well as emotion when the Routemaster were withdrawn from normal service in London. But everybody's instinctive image of a London bus is a front-engined, rear entrance and exit, elegant red bus. And for me, they are the buses of my youth. I both conducted and drove them in normal service from Riverside Garage at Hammersmith on the 9 and the 11 and the 72, and they're remarkably long-lasting in the sense that they were designed. So London Transport built aircraft for the RAF during the war, and in the course of it learnt how to build aluminium framed aircraft, and then applied that technique to a bus. So actually the Routemaster is almost indestructible, and because they're built of aluminium, have no rot in them. So the bodies at least will probably last forever. And they are elegant things. That a picture of a Routemaster in central London looks a natural part of the environment. So and I think so. As I got older and became the proprietor of London's Transport, I think it seemed perfectly natural to me to buy one. In fact, I've got two and a half now, all of which have been used on our architectural and property tours. And Peter, they're just lovely to drive. they were the design elegance of the outside extended to the interior. So actually, the driver's cabin, it's a bit of a hike to get in when you're 67. Once you're in there, you've got pretty good vision. It's a very simple vehicle to drive. You can see it a lot, and it is the perfect vehicle to drive around London. So when we were able to, I laid them up for March and April and May and June, because there was you shouldn't go out, and there was no point in doing it. But when we could, when I could tax one at the beginning of July, Leon Daniels and I took it out. We took 2 tyres from one of the others to Tilbury, but it was so lovely to drive through London in a London bus, and people wave at you and they take pictures of you, and you make them happy. So that's not a bad thing to do either, and you make yourself happy driving it.
And it must have been lovely driving through with not too much other traffic as well at the time, and much quicker route through London. So
well, it was yeah, it was extraordinary. I drove from Westbourne Park. I picked up Leon in Wapping, and once I got east of Oxford Circus, I mean, sadly, there weren't many people about.
Yeah, well, I think that's a sign of the changing makeup of London. Probably as we go forward, as you say, with more home working, we're probably going to see quite a shift in the way that people get around and how they get around and how we use the city. So thank you very much for your insights into transport and indeed into London. And I look forward to joining you in your Routemaster sometime in the not too distant future.
And so do I, Peter. Thank you very much.